Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today.
Prime Minister, you've said repeatedly you don't want to have an election campaign during the pandemic. Will you commit now to not going to see the Governor General, whether interim Governor General or permanent appointment, unless the House of Commons has voted a lack of confidence in you until the point that the World Health Organization declares the pandemic over?
As I've said, it has been one of the strengths of this country that political parties that across different orders of government and indeed within Parliament and assemblies have been able to work together to get unprecedented support out to Canadians. I made a promise from the very beginning that we would have Canadians' backs no matter what it took for as long as it took to get through this pandemic, and that has worked. And by and large, other parties have supported that. We have seen, however, that we need to continue to have a well-functioning Parliament so that we can continue to get support out to Canadians, and that is very much my focus. Nobody wants an election before the end of this pandemic, and we certainly hope to be able to continue to deliver all the helps that we promised to Canadians without over interference by opposition parties.
If you're seeing this video, it means that I was mad as hell about Justin Trudeau calling an unnecessary election during a pandemic. So with the worrying Delta variant making its way through the Canadian population, why would a party that cares about Canadians call a completely unnecessary election during a pandemic? To grab power, it's that simple. As we've seen in other parts of Canada, the COVID bump did wonders for the then minority governments of John Horgan and the NDP in BC, and the Progressive Conservative Party of Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick. And so, with Trudeau posting respectable polling numbers in the earlier parts of the pandemic, and also shortly before calling this election, it's clear the Liberals were seeing an opportunity and decided to take it. But do they actually deserve a majority government? And crucially, do they deserve a majority government again? This was a Liberal minority that called this unnecessary election because they were pushed into minority territory in the 2019 election. And so a lot of Canadians are rightfully asking during this point in time, well, hey, why didn't you do a lot of this stuff you're promising to do now when you've had not only 4 years of a majority to do it, so bully to anyone else who wanted to disagree with whatever you wanted to pass. In a minority, you still had a sizable chunk, meaning you could have easily worked with a handful of NDP, Green, Bloc, or Conservative MPs to get things done. So that's something that's in the back of mind for a lot of Canadians, and you should probably keep it in the back of yours as well. And a casual glance on the Bird site reveals that there's a lot of Liberal partisans over there. And with Liberal partisans thinking so highly of him, one might think he and the Liberals have actually done a good job at managing this pandemic. But if the Liberals want us as Canadians to vote for them and reward them with a majority government again, we should look to see if they've earned it, and keeping track of their promises is a good place to start. This brings us to Polymeter. So Polymeter is an independent initiative developed by political scientists that pretty much keeps track of promises that politicians make. It involves Vox Pop Labs, Chaire de Leadership en Enseignement des Sciences Sociales Numériques, the Center for Public Policy Analysis, and McMaster University's Digital Society Lab. In other words, respectable sources. So feel free to explore the evaluation in depth, but to broadly sum up, Trudeau and the Liberals have kept 45% of their promises, partially kept 27% of their promises, are in progress on 0% of their promises, because of the unnecessary election they called, and have outright broken 27% of their promises. To quote the guys from the Chernobyl miniseries, not great, not terrible. Oh, and even though this is, about promises, a lot of these aren't exactly promises that would grab media attention. For example, we will create an all-party committee to monitor and oversee the operations of every government department and agency with national security responsibilities. We will develop the Canadian Armed Forces into an agile, responsive, and well-equipped military force that can effectively defend Canada and North America, provide support during national disasters, humanitarian support missions, and peace operations. Or again, real bangers like, we will increase funding in these programs, Pro-Martin Trade Routes International Cultural Promotion, to $25 million each year. There's all their broken economic promises, And I remember a lot of Canadians cheering for this promise that was kept. To foster the creativity that leads to cutting-edge research, we will establish Canada Research Chairs in Sustainable Technology. Or, we will provide ways for Canadians to express their views and opportunities for experts to meaningfully participate in environmental assessment processes. And again, another thing to keep in mind is, sure, these are a bunch of examples that I've used for very small minor things that have been kept or partially kept or outright broken. But then one has to also keep in mind the context behind others like this one. We will launch a national public inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada to seek recommendations on concrete actions that governments, law enforcement, and others can take to solve these crimes and prevent future ones. And yeah, that was kept, and that's an objectively good thing. But in terms of a lot of its implementation, that's where the water gets very muddied, and where the Liberal government has dragged its feet and isn't trying to pressure provinces to do more on their end and within their jurisdiction. So sure, they've kept that promise, but are they actually upholding it? So I guess that brings us to the next logical point of, okay, then what are the really big ticket issues and policies that made people vote for Liberals in the first place, and that a lot of Canadians still want to see now, especially after a life-changing pandemic? Well, according to Abacus data, there is overwhelming support for a wealth tax, and not just across Canada, but across party lines as well. And after the 2019 election, support for electoral reform also jumped. In fact, it jumped by a lot. There's also solid majority support for childcare, dental care, pharmacare, mental health care, affordable housing, serious action on climate change, some form of UBI, and no doubt others that I'm missing just off the top of my head. And these are some pretty great policies with broad support from all Canadians and across party lines. So did the Liberals implement them? Or, when given the chance to do so by other parties, how did they vote? Oh no. Wow. Also, notice how the Liberals vote hand in hand with the Conservatives most of the time? That's not an accident. The Liberals and Conservatives often work together in the worst ways possible because they're just two sides of the same neoliberal order coin that actually runs things. This is why Liberals and Conservatives routinely refuse to implement policies that Canadians actually want. And yeah, sure, Liberals and Conservatives have a handful of big issue societal and economic differences, but their shared interests overlap far more than Canadians realize. Because ultimately, these are parties that serve the ruling class and the elites and not your average Canadian. A casual look at the voting record in Parliament shows that they vote together, overwhelmingly, a lot of the time. And many Canadians don't even realize this. Sure, the Liberals say the right things, but they never actually do them. And because these parties are so similar in so many ways, it's why swing voters are so essential. Hell, former Liberal MP Selena Cesar Chavanes is considering voting for the Conservative candidate in her riding. You'd think if the parties were so different that it was morally unthinkable to vote for the other party, she and other Liberals wouldn't even entertain the notion. But the dirty secret of Canadian politics is that they do. Look at this graph. NDP support has remained stable while support bled from the Liberal Party to the Conservative Party at the same time and in the same numbers. These are swing voters who feel perfectly comfortable switching between the parties because to them there is little fundamental difference between Team Red and Team Blue. And yet still, there's a lot of people who continue to blindly support the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau, as well as blatantly untrue political myths. Here's just a handful of examples.
The purpose of the majority is to have a mandate to move things forward during this crisis.
Except there was no issue with moving things forward. Parties like the NDP and Green Party were more than happy to support the Liberals on policy that they could agree on. In fact, it was thanks to having a Liberal minority government that the CERB was expanded to more Canadians. It was because of their minority that students actually got some financial support during the pandemic. It was because of the minority government and the Liberals having to work with the NDP that the emergency wage subsidy was introduced. Also, the emergency wage subsidy was originally an NDP idea. And it was also thanks to Jagmeet Singh and the NDP for getting paid sick leave for all workers. All this only happened because the Liberals had a minority government and needed support from the NDP and various other parties in Parliament.
NDP's solution is based on the Liberals' Hoskin report, which Liberals are implementing. How original of the NDP to take credit for work done by the Liberals on pharmacare. NDP and Singh are a joke.
And yet, as far back as 2019, it was clear that the Liberals were not setting aside enough money to implement the Hoskins report. And earlier this year, doctors slammed the Liberal Party for putting national pharmacare on the back burner of the latest budget. It's been 25 or so years now. The Liberals have had ample opportunity, ample support, and several majority governments by this point. They have had numerous chances to move this forward, and yet they routinely choose not to.
Let's not split the vote, allowing conservatives to worm their way in. Vote Liberal, Canada.
As I showed earlier, vote splitting happens because of swing voter Liberals who feel just at home with the Conservatives as they do with the Liberals. NDP support has remained relatively stable and consistent. You're talking to the wrong people here.
Voting Conservative would be throwing away any chance at tackling climate change, and after yesterday's UN report, this would be the worst possible time to vote for them. They only care about the almighty dollar, not Canadians. The only party for the future are the Liberals.
Ha! The Libs don't care about climate change. They can't even meet Harper's terrible targets, for God's sake. They also bought a pipeline and continue to defend it. Oh, and they continue to try and make justifications for that pipeline, such as, well, we need it so we can get money to invest in green energy, even though the recent reports tell us we absolutely should not do any new fossil fuel extraction or exploitation. Which again, I guess means it's a good time to bring up this old tidbit where Justin Trudeau said, no nation would find oil in the ground and just leave it there.
As I said on the very first trip to the oil patch back in 2012, no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there.
Well, dude, if you care about climate change like you say you do, then you need to not extract it and you need to leave it in the ground. That is assuming you care, but we know you don't. Oh, and the Liberals campaigned hard for 2 other pipelines and have supported the expansion of the existing Line 3 and Line 5 pipelines. Also, how are those billion trees coming along? Real talk, continuing to vote Liberal or Conservative is what's actually throwing away our chance at tackling the climate crisis.
I hope Liberals gain a majority. Their good sense of governance is why Canada has managed to handle the pandemic relatively well. I would really feel for Canada if the Conservative Party wins, because they're less likely to care about the health of the general public.
You're right about the Conservative Party. But the reason why Canada has managed to handle the pandemic relatively well is because we had a minority government. And by having that minority government, it's what allowed the NDP to actually pressure the Liberals into doing the right thing. We did relatively well precisely because of the NDP and having a Liberal minority government. If the Liberals had a majority, this would have been a very different story entirely.
Well, I guess I'm not educated like you. All I know is we hardly have an army. That's why we're called peacekeepers. We go in after everyone has fought so we can pull out people and apologize for America kicking their asses.
So, I got some bad news for you, pal. Canadian peacekeeping levels are at their lowest point in more than 60 years. There were only 35 Canadian military and police officers deployed on peacekeeping operations at the end of April of 2020. That's not even enough for a platoon. I really don't think that's making the difference between war and peace. Additionally, Canada is now, at least according to a 2016 article, the second biggest arms exporter to the Middle East, which means I get to talk about the controversial arms deal with Saudi Arabia for a hot second. That was an arms deal that the Liberals brokered and campaigned hard for, even though they criticized Harper for making the initial deal, and in spite of the fact that most Canadians don't want it to go through. And I think some government accountability agency or something also showed that the Liberals broke protocol and their own policy, and their justification was not actually justified or justifiable for fulfilling the arms deal. In short, we are not peacekeepers anymore. We haven't been for a long time. And these are just a handful of examples from around the internet of people so blindly loyal to the Liberals or outright ignorant of the abuses and rampant hypocrisy that comes from them. Again, let's just take a casual look at what the Liberals have said and done over their 6 years in power. Liberals voted against a proposal to end tax avoidance practiced by shell companies in Barbados. They voted against capping stock option loopholes and combating tax havens. They voted against placing a new 1% tax on wealth over 20 million. And then Trudeau has the audacity to say that he sees no path for basic income right now, even though, again, a majority of Canadians support that policy, including in his own party. The Liberals made this big announcement about the new federal program on housing, this bold new national housing strategy. Here's what that bold new national housing strategy does in the first 3 years. A 15% cut assisting low-income households, a 42% cut in number of social housing units, 50% of funding not spent, and for every dollar given to developers for expensive rentals, only 32 cents in short-term tenant benefits. Wow, that is so wonderful. But again, want to stress here, because I know there's a bunch of Liberal partisans thinking, oh, but come on, the Liberals always support this stuff. Liberals haven't supported this in decades. In fact, it was under the Chrétien Liberals that completely gutted social and affordable housing in this country. And if you look down there, that little uptick, that was Stephen Harper's first year in power. Like, it is so wild to me that people think that Liberals care, and yet there's so many examples of them just going mask off and showing us that they don't. If the Liberals actually believed in climate science, their climate policies would reflect this and follow the recommendations of climate scientists. But they don't, because Liberals are just yet another side of the neoliberal coin that has ruined the world and continues to ruin the world. And then there's this, kind of scary one. The Liberals and Conservatives voted against recognizing the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from the use of nuclear weapons. And they also voted against reaffirming the need to make every effort to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. That's just a little concerning. But again, to go back to the voting record, Libs and Conservatives tend to vote together time and time again. Cap the near $1 billion in stock options deductions loophole and crack down on tax havens overseas. NDP voted yay, Liberals and Conservatives voted nay. And with all the terrible climate news, the Liberals still had the audacity to say they must maximize revenue from the Trans Mountain Pipeline in order to fight climate change. That's like chopping down a forest to say that you need wood and stakes for the signs that are saying end climate change now. And since the Liberals clearly care so much about the climate, one has to wonder then about why they gave $18 billion in financial supports for the fossil fuel industry last year. But yeah, no, we totally have no money for UBI or any real meaningfully funded progressive policies. Please ignore that we didn't support a marginal tax rate on the wealthiest 1%. There's no new funds for pharmacare. Their middle class tax cut didn't even actually help the middle class. And again, Justin Trudeau is basically lying here on Twitter when he says that this is why we're going to implement universal pharmacare. It's not universal pharmacare, it's a $50 deduction. That is pennies, my guy. But yet, hey, Justin Trudeau apparently cares about old people and the tragedy that was long-term care. And, he said, even in that tweet, we're going to add more funding to our universal healthcare system, right? Actually, no. During a parliamentary vote to sustainably increase Canada health transfers by end of 2020 in order to support the efforts of the government of Quebec and the provinces, healthcare workers, and the public, the Liberals were the single party to vote nay, whereas all other parties voted yay. But yeah, they totally care about adequately funding our healthcare system. Oh, and they're also clawing back CERB from elderly people who got it but were also on their pensions. And so, whoa, that's too much free money there. You better give some of that back, old man, as opposed to adequately taxing billionaires in offshore tax havens. Not even kidding. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government literally cut off seniors from income supplement after they received emergency benefits. That's the kind, caring, real progressive and pragmatic party of Canada, people. And again, when parties like the NDP and the Green Party and even the Bloc asked the government to bring forward funding to invest in housing and supports that meet the needs of Indigenous, seniors, and disabled Canadians, invest in a plan to end homelessness, expanding rent supplements, and investing in construction and renovation of affordable housing and co-ops, the Liberals and the Conservatives voted nay. When the NDP wanted to create a standing committee on arms exports review, the Liberals and the Conservatives voted nay. The Liberals, who again claim to care about the pandemic and seniors and how terrible everything has been, when presented with the opportunity to recognize that the elderly were most directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, to recall that too many of the elderly live in a financially precarious position, acknowledge the collective debt that we owe to those who built Quebec and Canada, and ask the government in the next budget to increase the old age security benefit by $110 a month for those aged 65 and more, the Liberals were the sole dissenting voice in Parliament. When asked to increase the special employment insurance sickness benefits from 15 weeks to 50 weeks in the upcoming budget in order to support people with serious illnesses such as, cancer, the Liberals were the only party to vote nay. Again, really want to stress here, this is supposed to be the kind, caring, and progressive party of Canada that is so much better than the Conservatives, right? And I know I've hit on this point before, but I think it really needs just real reinforcement. The Liberals and Conservatives, as you can see here, vote hand in hand the overwhelming majority of the time. And unfortunately, the times they do vote in favor of something is in the worst possible instances. Otherwise, they show a kind of weird solidarity. And these are all verifiable in the records of Parliament. And these aren't selective, there's like dozens of these. And I haven't even touched on Trudeau's many personal scandals, such as blackface, and the scandals of his government, such as the We Charity affair and the SNC-Lavalin affair. They say they're feminists, but look how they treated Jean Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould. Look how they treated the aforementioned and now former Liberal MP Cesar Chavez. They say they care about climate change, but their track record is the worst in the G7. They say they care about housing and the poor and supporting Canadians, and yet provinces like Ontario will see less money under the Liberal National Housing Strategy, not more. With all these problems and all these bold-faced lies and blatant hypocrisy and voting more often with the Conservatives than with anyone else, is this really what liberalism is? There's a decent article on Medium by Rich Penny. God, that's an amazing name. That's titled, "Did I Leave Liberalism or Did Liberalism Leave Me?" It's a halfway solid article in just a 5-minute read, and it all revolves around his realization that his politics didn't change, but that the definition of liberal changed.
The only thing that's changed in the last 18 years is that I went from being someone who tolerates capitalism to someone who openly opposes it. But I never liked capitalism. I never thought that it was moral or fair or efficient. I was simply a young man swimming in a sea of capitalist propaganda. I hadn't learned enough about the world to know that the narrative I heard from my teachers, parents, and the media was bullshit.
This author managed to wake up and see modern liberalism for the destructive farce that it is. And yet, unfortunately, millions of Canadians continue to blindly and faithfully serve a party that doesn't serve their interests, nor does it implement the policies that they want and policies that they have claimed to support and will implement, just trust us, for literal decades now. And many of them will use fear of the Conservatives to insist that voting Liberal is your only choice to keep the darkness at bay, even though it's historically been Liberals supporting Conservatives in minority governments. It's a scam. It's high time that people actually begin to recognize that it's the NDP, that cares about them and Canadians. If it's not going to be on the Liberals' radar or politically advantageous, they're not going to do it. If it's not going to please their sponsors, Liberals aren't going to do it. If it's not going to please their corporate overlords, Liberals and Conservatives aren't going to do it. The NDP is the only main federal party that actually cares about the working class. And if you don't believe me, again, just look at what they managed to accomplish in 2020. They managed to accomplish expanded coverage for the CERB, they got support for students, and they were the ones who initially came up with the emergency wage subsidy proposal. They also secured 10 days paid sick leave for all workers, whether in the gig economy or not, or you work at Air Canada, or you're a grocery store clerk, or you're a pizza delivery driver. The NDP won workers 10 paid sick days, not the Liberals, not the Conservatives, the NDP. Team Orange. It was a great win for all workers because that's what the NDP cares about. They care about your average Canadian from coast to coast. All these developments I just mentioned and others are meaningful and good progressive actions that are happening here in Canada, and it's not being led by the Liberals or the Conservatives. It's being led by boots on the ground, and their only federal advocate is the NDP. It is so frustrating to see the NDP get win after win for the common man and woman and the average working Joe and Jane. And yet more people just aren't supporting them and voting for them, even though the NDP has shown support for us. They've shown support for workers, students, natives, and all Canadians, regardless of our religion or our skin color or our background. When does it end? We keep falling for volatile polls and become entrenched in this cynical and strategic voting pattern. And the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. Why? Because Team Red and Team Blue both know that they will get their chance at power eventually again. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Maybe the Liberals will pass pharmacare this time. I'm sure they'll pass electoral reform this time. Surely we'll get childcare this time. It's literally been decades at this point. And the Liberals say nice things while cutting funding but making the numbers look good. Poll after poll and article after article shows a real appetite for change among the Canadian populace. Solid support for social housing and social programs. But the Liberals, like the Conservatives, have gutted those and refuse to scale up funding to actually pay for what needs to be paid. They refuse to raise taxes on billionaires and the businesses, all in the interest of their true masters, the neoliberal elites. It has been the NDP fighting for your average Canadian. It has been the NDP winning some absolutely crucial victories during this pandemic. Not the Liberals, and certainly not the Conservatives. When will we, as Canadians, finally have the courage to ditch the binary that has brought us to this point and just blatantly shown us how terrible and unequal everything truly is? We recognize the problems and the inequity in our society, and yet we're going to still vote for one of the two parties that let it get to this point? Like, hello? As I pointed out in a previous video, Justin Trudeau called this election for a power grab, and no doubt to do some seriously shady things that he needs a majority to do. They're gonna try and cut more programs and cut more funding because, well, the pandemic is winding down and our bills are coming due. And the history in Parliament tells us that it is the Liberals who will work with the Conservatives and vice versa, meaning that whoever wins this election, Canadians lose. Unless we actually change the way we vote. We change the way we vote, and we vote with courage and hope and optimism and idealism. And we hold our politicians to account when they fail to deliver on promises they made to us in exchange for them having power. Canadians clearly want change. It's time we vote for it. But unfortunately, ignorant Liberal partisans are going to continue to blindly give their votes to Trudeau and the Liberal Party when they clearly don't deserve them, and that is what's bothering me today. Hi, you're still here. Thank you, everyone, for watching this. I especially want to take time, and that's part of why we're doing this extra add-on here, to thank the very talented Aranock, Ninetails Cosmic Fox, Waffle To The Left, Caelan Conrad, Pinko Punko, and Goblin for lending their voices to portray liberal partisans on Twitter. Thank you all so much for your support in helping to make this video and for your patience. And thank you to everyone who watched this, especially through to the end. So this will probably be one of the few times I say this, is that if you really liked it, like and subscribe. And also don't forget to check out the channels of everyone who helped make this video possible. I've put all their information and their social media links down below in the description. This was a lot of fun to make, but at the same time, as you can tell, it's very late now. And yeah, I had hoped to have this done when the election started, but then a lot of real life stuff started happening. It was like, oh God, am I even gonna make it? But it's here now. So once again, thank you everyone. Thank you for the contributing voices to all my cool comrades online. And thank you everyone who's here. Again, a huge shout out to my patrons for continuing to support this channel after all this time. I appreciate each and every single one of you, which, oh yeah, I have a Patreon now. I've had it for, I think, a year almost. And so there is some exclusive content over there, and there will be more coming in the near future. So if that's something that you may be interested in, consider signing up. And don't forget, folks, if you're Canadian, register to vote, and vote anyone but liberal or conservative. Because that duopoly is what got us into this problem in the first place, and that people think that one of these two parties is somehow going to be the way out of it is definitely what's bothering me today.